I think most people here know me. I'm one of the co-chairs of the Ukraine Socialist Solidarity Campaign. And the topic of this forum is one that, nobody wants to talk about, as I said a few minutes ago, which is the plans that the MAGA movement and Trump and his supporters have to overthrow or steal the election in the event that they lose. So obviously for us, it's a really serious topic, but in the aftermath of the hoopla and the flag waving and the hype of the Democratic convention, people who are completely opposed to Trump don't even want to think about that. It's going to be fine. It's in the bag. The Democratic lawyers have got this, but we're not so sure about that. So anyhow, John's going to give a presentation of about 20 minutes.
About 25, I think.
Yeah, that's fine. And then we'll have a full discussion about what's going on and what, if anything, can be done or should be done.
So I want to start just with this short video.
You won't have to do it anymore. 4 more years, you know what? It'll be fixed, it'll be fine. You won't have to vote anymore, my beautiful Christians. I love you, Christians. I'm a Christian. I love you. Get out. You gotta get out and vote. In 4 years, you don't have to vote again. We'll have it fixed so good you're not gonna have to vote.
Hello, DC. We got any patriots out there tonight? You hear me? God is on our side.
The night before the January 6th insurrection, Block preached at Freedom Plaza in Washington, D.C.
I don't know about you, but I ain't packing up, slacking up, or shutting up until I've been taken up by the glory of God. If you believe that, patriots, say amen out here. We're a mighty army.
If that side loses, it is going to feel as if God's will has been thwarted.
I'm telling you, we need lions to take back this republic, so America's going to remain a Christian nation.
Christian nationalism is a term that in recent years has been used to describe a political ideology that fuses patriotism with Christianity. Experts use the term to describe a group of people who believe America was founded as a Christian nation that needs to be restored to its Judeo-Christian roots. About 20% of Americans strongly embrace Christian nationalism.
Of God, as they interpret it. Trump supporters are increasingly overt in their calls to replace democracy with a MAGA theocracy.
If 10 years ago, you had told me that we'd be seeing scenes like what we just saw in this video, I'd have said you were being hysterical. And I learned something from that. But still, in reviewing what I'm going to present this morning, I had to ask myself again if I was at least exaggerating the extent of the danger. This video should serve as a reminder of what is possible. And Trump and company have also learned something from January 6th. They learned that a direct, violent coup was not possible. So they had to lay different plans. So what they've been preparing for the last 4 years is a coup with a legal or constitutional cover. That is what the recent Supreme Court ruling on presidential immunity represents. In that ruling, the MAGA majority on the Supreme Court just simply made up what amounts to a new law out of whole cloth, that the President of the United States is above the law, that he can do whatever he likes, and is not subject to legal prosecution. In other words, this legalizes the overthrow of the rule of capital through democracy. The owners of capital in the U.S. have ruled through democratic means ever since the Civil War ended nearly 160 years ago. It's been the most successful such rule in history. So the questions that we have to ask ourselves are, number one, how did that base develop to overthrow bourgeois democracy? And how did capitalists like Yarvin, Thiel, and Elon Musk develop such enormous conceit that they came to view the overthrow of this 160-year method of rule as actually possible and even desirable? Second, what exactly are the means through which they intend to carry out this constitutional coup? And finally, third, what are some of the possible outcomes of whether the coup succeeds or not, and what can we do about it? What I'm not going to get into is whether the outcome matters very much. Anybody who's not living in an alternate reality knows the answer to that, as this video we just watched shows. Now, normally, we think of the establishment of authoritarian rule as happening when there's a crisis in society, when the working class is actually challenging the rule of capital. But I think that just the opposite is true in this case. Here is where that proverbial horseshoe concept comes into play. You have the opposite ends of the spectrum leading towards the same result. I think that what we have is an enormous crisis in the US working class. And incidentally, we're not the only country with such a crisis. We've had a nearly 80-year war against all the best traditions of struggle of the US working class. And a leading force in that war has been every wing of the leadership of the US working class, which is to say the union leadership. They have brought all the propaganda of the capitalist class directly into the mass organizations, the only mass organizations that workers have ever built in the US, the unions. They have succeeded in alienating the vast majority of union members from their own unions. The union leadership has buttressed the capitalist propaganda of individualism, which is the exact opposite of working class solidarity. All this has created utter confusion within the working class. The non-profiteers, of course, have also played their part in all this. Now, normally, a certain tension exists under capitalist democracy between the drive of the capitalists to complete domination as opposed to the resistance of the working class and the oppressed, the latter of whom must ultimately depend on support of at least a major sector of the working class. But what happens when one side fragments, when the working class no longer is any sort of independent power? Then a vacuum develops, and something must fill that vacuum. That is what the forces of the potential coup represent, a drive to fill that vacuum. The rise of the far right and its support from a small wing of the US capitalist class does not result from a threat to capitalism from the working class. On the contrary, it results from the crisis of confusion and fragmentation in the working class. This crisis has created So Donald Trump discovered when he was president that he could not get the military tops to carry out a coup. On two separate occasions, he wanted the generals to call the troops out into the streets. And on both occasions, the top generals made it clear that they would not obey such an order. So Trump and his MAGA leaders tried to overturn the elections by the legal route. But it was unplanned. It was an unplanned hit or miss plan, and it crumbled like a house of cards, just as did the January 6th attempt at a violent coup, which also was hardly planned. So since then, they've had 4 years to organize and refine their plans and to seize complete control over one of the two main capitalist parties, the Republican Party. Now, before I get into their known plans for a constitutional coup, I have to mention the plans that probably exist beneath the surface, plans for a violent terrorist attacks on voting centers and on places where the votes are counted. I think the video that I showed demonstrates that such plans most likely are in the works. Trump and MAGA discovered that an outright frontal attack like January 6th won't work. They also found that there's a real risk of infiltration, like what happened when these types planned to kidnap and murder the Democratic governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer. So they went into a decline after January 6th, but they also reorganized themselves. One of the foremost groups is the American Patriots 3 Percenters, or AP3. 3 Percenters, by the way, refers to, they talk about it was only 3% of the population that carried out the American Revolution. So the AP3 is already active on the southern border, quote, rounding up immigrants. AP3 has connections with various sheriffs and police and law enforcement members. The New American Journal quoted one of them as saying, quote, "The next election won't be decided at a ballot box. It'll be decided at the ammo box." And he said he's ready to force his way into voting centers if need be, or, quote, "whatever it takes." A study by the Institute for Strategic Development shows that these terrorist groups have reconstituted themselves to make infiltration by the FBI and other law enforcement agencies more difficult. So we simply don't know what their plans are or what they might do. But we have to keep that danger in mind. Now, with that in mind, let's take a look at their plans for a coup under legal cover. To get a glimpse of these plans, we should turn to what happened in Fulton County, Georgia, in the May 2024 primary election. Fulton County, of course, is the county in which Atlanta is located and is the absolute epicenter of the Democratic vote in Georgia because it contains the great majority of Black voters in the state. If the Democrats are to have any chance to win the state, they must get a huge majority in Fulton County. And something peculiar happened in the May primary in Fulton County. One of the election board members, Julie Adams, refused to certify the vote. Now remember, this was a statewide primary, which would just simply determine which two candidates would be in the November runoff for state office. It had nothing to do with the presidential election or even the presidential primary, which had been held in March. So why would Adams refuse to certify the vote? The answer is to be found in understanding who Julie Adams is. She is the state head of the America First Policy Institute, the AFPI. This is a multi-million-dollar institute tied in with Trump and with such foundations as Judicial Watch, which has done so much to enable MAGA to take over the judicial system. And Adams' refusal to certify the vote in that key county for the state, a swing state, and possibly the nation, was a test run for the federal election. Adams is not alone. According to Rolling Stone, some 70 election deniers now serve on election boards in key swing states of Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, North Carolina, and Pennsylvania. So we can count on the effort of Julie Adams to be repeated 50, 60, 70 times or more. This in itself can tend to overwhelm the system. Then, on top of that, we have had the harassment and threats of the election officials and just rank and file poll workers, those who actually count the ballots. According to the Brennan Center, 38% of poll workers have reported such harassment and threats of violence, including threats to their lives and the lives of their families. This has caused massive resignations and retirements, and as a result, over 25% of those who will be administering the elections will be doing so for the first time. The result of lack of experience can be seen in one simple mistake. In the 2020 election district of Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, poll workers simply didn't have enough paper of the proper thickness on hand, and this led to an hours-long delay in voting. That, of course, led to all sorts of wild conspiracy theories. Now multiply that by scores of times over, and you get a sense of the chaos that can result. You get a sense of the excuses the election deniers can seize upon to refuse to certify the vote. Now, we should not get carried away here. Again, according to the Brennan Center and others, certification of vote results is not optional. The election boards are not created to interpret the law. They're not created to decide if votes are legitimate or not. Their role is purely to serve as human adding machines. In other words, just to count up the number of votes for which candidate in the election which they are dealing with. And in all of the 60 plus court cases arising from the 2020 election, the courts ruled fairly quickly against the challenges. But such challenges can create a climate, a base for further challenges. Nor can we rule out the possibility that an entire local election board would refuse to count the votes. Normally, we can expect the courts to resolve this fairly quickly. That is not necessarily true in 2024, as we will see. In 2022, the Presidential Electoral Count Reform Act was passed. That act provides for quick federal court action in case of disputes of election results. In other words, disruptions by election denying officials. It also provides for a means of preventing individual rogue federal judges, like, for instance, Eileen Cannon in Florida, from playing a role. It also provides for quick resolution by the Supreme Court. But here a question arises. The act provides for a key role to be played by the state's governor. That would seem to fly in the face of an extreme legal theory called the independent state legislature theory. This theory claims that the state legislatures are the one and only authority in everything to do with running elections, including determining its outcome. Now, in 2023, the Supreme Court ruling in Moore versus Harper, the Supreme Court majority rejected that legal theory. But in Justices Thomas, Alito, and Gorsuch dissented. They, in effect, accepted the independent state legislature theory. Since then, the rest of the MAGA injustices, most especially Chief Injustice John Roberts, have gone further down that road. That's what we saw in the ruling that a president, meaning Trump, is immune from criminal prosecution for any so-called official act. To repeat, there's absolutely nothing in the law or in the Constitution that justifies this ruling. They, in effect, simply created a new law. In the past, Roberts was concerned that the court would retain some degree of credibility, that a majority of the public would see the court as being above politics. This ruling was a declaration by him, this immunity ruling, that he didn't give a damn how the court was perceived anymore. He sensed the MAGA victory, and that was that. So, whether the Supreme Court's MAGA majority could travel down that road of the independent state legislature theory after the coming election is an open question, and I'll return to that later. Now, as we remember, in 2020, the electoral count in Congress was challenged by a couple of senators and a few representatives. The Federal Electoral Count Reform Act tightens up the requirements to require 1/5 of members in each house for a challenge to be considered. I think it's pretty likely that there will be such numbers if Harris wins. For such challenges to succeed, the Republicans would need a majority in both houses. That was why Trump, after a several-week delay, held his first election rally out in Montana in early August. He is sure to win Montana by double digits, but there the incumbent senator is a Democrat, John Tester, and Trump was campaigning for his Republican rival. A key to overturning the election, should that be necessary for them, will be for the Republicans to gain a majority in the Senate, and the Montana Senate race gives them a good chance. Now, what is the Democrat strategy for preventing the MAGA Republicans from overturning the election and instituting a constitutional coup? A few weeks ago, liberal TV personality Rachel Maddow interviewed, quote, progressive Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren, and Maddow posed this exact question to her. Warren gave two answers. First is to run up the votes for Democrats all up and down the ballot, so the result is so overwhelming that they cannot overturn it. The second part of the strategy is to take it to the courts. It's not ruled out that the Democrats can get an overwhelming victory, but that is by no means assured. In fact, at this time, the result is very much up in the air. I think if the Democrats do gain an overwhelming victory, that will intimidate the election deniers, including those on the election commissions. Many of them will back off from trying to overturn the election. Even the MAGA injustices on the Supreme Court would feel the pressure. To get elected, a presidential candidate must get at least 270 electoral college votes. What would happen if Harris got that number or only slightly more? I think that situation, which is entirely possible, would send the election deniers into overdrive. It's exactly such a contingency for which they are planning. It cannot be ruled out that so many challenges could be made at the county level, that the state boards could be overwhelmed and one or two could simply find it, quote, impossible to rule. All sorts of delays and confusions are possible. The MAGA majority on the Supreme Court is waiting for that, like a fox waits for the gopher to emerge from its hole. It's impossible to predict exactly how court challenges could reach the Supreme Court or what the pro-MAGA decision the majority could reach. Another route for a legal coup would be this. If Harris wins a slim majority of electoral votes, then because of the electoral math, it's most likely that the Senate will swing Republican. Because of gerrymandering, the House could stay in the Republicans' grip. In that case, and if the vice president, who is Harris for the moment, declares a Democrat victory, it's certain that the results from at least that come from at least one state would be challenged. The challenge would be to the results in one particular state or a series of states, maybe Wisconsin, for example. In that case, it's most likely that the challenge would win in both the House of Representatives and the Senate if the Republicans have a majority in both houses. And keep in mind, all the Republican majority has to do is deprive the Democratic contender of the majority of potential electoral votes. They have to get, one candidate has to get at least 270 electoral votes. If there are enough states that cannot send in electoral votes by January 6th, so that neither candidate gets a majority of all the 538 electoral votes, then the House of Representatives chooses the next president. Each delegation from each state gets one vote. It doesn't matter if the delegation has 2 delegates, as Montana has, or 52 delegates, as California has. Each delegation gets one vote. And since the majority of states are rural, and the MAGAists are in the majority in those states, it's certain that the House of Representatives would install Trump. Or they would if the Democrats' game plan, as outlined by Elizabeth Warren, among others, is adhered to. That's where the movement from below comes in. A popular Black Instagrammer in Atlanta, Talia, who has some 25,000 followers, was asked on Instagram what Black people in Atlanta would do if the Republicans try to steal the election. Her answer was succinct. They're going to riot, she wrote. It seems pretty certain that there would be mass protests in the country. In fact, that could happen even before the election if the fascist groups conduct terrorist attacks on voters or on Black and Latino populations. What would be the response of the Democrats and their fronts, the NGOs and the union leadership? We know that in 2000, they did their best to prevent protests in Florida from the stealing of the election down there. In 2020, the Democrats carried out the same legal-based strategy. And that's exactly what Elizabeth Warren is advocating for today. So if Harris wins, I think there would be a crisis inside the Republican Party. Hundreds of Republican officials would suddenly discover that they never did support Trump. Already we see signs of that, such as the several Republican speakers at the recent Democratic convention. And the Democrats are hoping to return to the whole bipartisan monopoly that already is on its deathbed. Of course, if Trump and Vance get in, then all bets are off for what might happen, as Cheryl showed in her presentation on August 4th. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, what role can those who understand the extreme danger of MAGA and a possible MAGA coup play? What role can we play? And right now, I think the overwhelming mood of those who want to fight MAGA is just to elect Harris and the Democrats and hope for the best. If the Democrats get in, they are sure to disappoint many millions. And if they don't, MAGA will feel enormously empowered and become even more aggressive. No matter what the outcome, MAGA is not going away. And in fact, increased violence from groups like AP3 I think, are likely, and the Democrats will prove once again incapable of dealing with it adequately. I hope that that will lead to a transformation of the mood amongst at least a sector of the working class and working class youth, and that is what we have to look for. It seems to me that the unions have to be at the center of such a resistance, but the union leadership will be reluctant at best to act. So central to any plan is to find some union members who might be willing to bring it up inside their unions and in their workplaces. The goal could be for the unions to organize a meeting of all union members and supporters to discuss this danger and what the unions can do to counter it. Maybe we can start discussions around this in our communities and or in schools, and through that, find the ones and twos of union members. Through that, MAGA resistance committees could be built. Such committees absolutely must be organized democratically with regular meetings and an elected leadership. That way, no matter what the outcome of the November elections, the beginning of a working class-based movement could develop. That is one possible avenue of approach for now. As events proceed, who knows what will develop? For example, if there is a terrorist attack, that could lead to events in a very different direction. But either way, we have to start looking for ways of organizing now and be prepared for the unexpected. Thank you.
Okay. Clay's got his hand raised. Go ahead, Clay.
Get unmute here. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. John, I thought that was a very good presentation, and it was really good in terms of hitting on this extreme danger the MAGA movement poses now, and in many ways that they can attempt to legally or illegally seize power. But once again, I think it missed the point in terms of what we are dealing with here. And frankly, I don't see why. To me, it's you, and when I say you, I'm talking about a portion of the left that I call the white left, refuse to see what is glaringly so in front of me when I look at this situation. And that is that what we're facing more so than anything else is a resurgence of white supremacy. And where you see the union leadership, corrupt union leadership, is the main barrier to a working class party and working class power, I see white supremacy in this resurgence of it. And frankly, I see it everywhere. Maybe that's because I watch a lot of Fox News. But when you look at their propaganda, when you look at their program, this is what ties it all together. Immigration, they focus on immigration, but not just immigration, the immigration of Black and brown people, because that is like an entry-level thing that they can build demands, white supremacist demands around. But they take it further than just immigration. They tie it to this whole great replacement theory, which you can see the MAGA movement has embraced fully and pushes at every turn. The concept, not just that the Republicans are failing to secure the borders, but they are willfully doing this so that they can enroll more Black and brown people as voters here to pollute the voting rolls, which in their point of view should be almost entirely white, if not completely white. And that's why they're doing that. The other side of that, and again tied to white supremacy, is the extreme need to increase the birth rate. And by that, they mean the white birth rate. And here we get into their opposition to abortion, their opposition to even birth control, and their opposition, churling about the vaccine, free vasectomies at the DNC, shows that their opposition even goes so far as to anything that they see as maybe limiting fertility, because they see this extreme need to increase the white population, again tied to white supremacy. So and their opposition to sexual relations and sexual modes of identifying that aren't the binary that directly leads to reproduction. They oppose that. Again, all these things tie back to that. But when I hear your presentation, what do I not hear talked about? This problem. We talk about the danger of fascism. Nobody or only a few extreme right-wing people are attracted to fascism. My son said, very interesting comment from my son. We're talking about the Magnum movement and, the fight for democracy. He said, for these people, the danger to democracy is not a bug, it's a feature, And that's true. And the reason why so many people, especially white working class people, are willing to accept and get behind authoritarian movement is not because they are pro-fascist or pro-authoritarian on its own sake. It's because they're convinced that if it's not going to be a white majority ruling democratically, they'd rather have a white minority or even a white authoritarian leader. So again, while we talk about the danger of fascism comes from the resurgence of white supremacy. But what is missing from the discussion? That. And what needs to be taken on? That. Where do we need to win the workers? On that. Where do we need to cleanse the left? Is in that. And yet, somehow, it's not in the discussion. I think it should be in the forefront of the discussion. Anyway, my 2 cents worth.
Thank you, Clay. Linda.
Oh, yeah, hi. There's another aspect to John's presentation that we should look at, which is that even if everything goes just swimmingly and there's an overwhelming victory, and there could be, because the gender politics, which I think is probably more important than the racial politics, although I agree with Clay that the racism is important, the gender politics is really coming to the fore, and it's not discussed at all because I don't know why, but there are pro-choice initiatives in several swing states. There could be an avalanche. There really could be a landslide for Harris, and just based on that, on the gender politics, and it could be really unexpected too, because a lot of the people registering to vote are first-time voters. There's a huge upsurge of first-time voters, mostly young women, are registering to vote. And even if everything went really well and it was an overwhelming victory, and this is always going to be a problem. The Democrats aren't going to do anything to suppress fascism, even if they win overwhelmingly. They'll have some kind of Merrick Garland type overseeing the prosecutions of people that never take place, and all the other little symbolic things that they do to make it look like they're actually clamping down on these people, but it just never happens. These court cases are a travesty. Although I have to say that this country's probably gone a lot farther than any other country faced with a fascist threat to push back, but it's mostly because the people are willing to do that. And this is what you'll see the Democrats do: is it'll always be on the voters, or the poll workers, or these people over here, or these people over there, the women trying to get abortion. It's always going to be on the lower 90% to fight the fascists, because the people in power are never going to do anything to really put these people down. They're going to always, try and play with them to mostly to suppress the left. they view fascism as a way of, repressing the left and getting them out of the way. This is, it just takes I mean, I'm going to sound really exasperated too, but it's just, that's what we can look forward to. Is that just a permanent existential crisis where everybody has to risk their life to vote for a non-fascist candidate every year, or every 4 years, or really every election probably, who aren't going to do anything to stop the problem. The problem will just gradually get worse and worse, while the average citizen has to risk their life to try and hold back the threat. That's all I have to say.
Talmadge.
Yeah, thank you, Clay, for bringing that up, and also thank you, Linda, for this. I mean, I think one of the ways to understand this, and T Corp put this in the chat, is really, I know it's tried to say intersectionality these days, but in fact, I think that concept of the intersection between race, class, gender, sexuality is essentially the struggles that we're seeing played out in front of us. To kind of follow Clay's point, I want to remind folks that when we talk about prior forms of fascism, we're talking about a racialized cultural motif. Rather, it's Mussolini going into North Africa and trying to recover the idea of the early Roman Empire, but with the exclusion of people who were, in fact, a different skin color. Or we talk about Adolf Hitler, who organized around the hatred of Jews in his mind as an ethnic group. And the Slavs as a subhuman group. If we think about Japan's invasion of China and its conquering of Korea during the Second World War, we're also talking about this idea of racial superiority. In all of these cases, the fascism was informed first and foremost, yes, by class struggle, but also, and first and foremost, it was played out through cultural struggles about racial identity and ethnic identity. This is exactly what has been coming up in America. It's documented by Arlie Hochschild's great book on the Tea Party movement, where she spent 5 years in Louisiana with these folks that are what we now think of as Trump supporters, in which their whole grievance procedure is based upon Black and brown people jumping ahead of the line, so to speak, in terms of their successes. Even when we're talking about folks who have good jobs, right? So there's a racial component of this, or the idea of racial resentment about this, manifested in the Great Replacement theory. The class structure of this process is more complicated, as John points out, because a lot of it has to do with the selling out of the labor unions, the leadership anyway, from the workers themselves. But I just wanted to remind all of us that these struggles are not one way or the other. They include all these, include race, they include class issues, they include gender issues, sexuality issues, and we need to see them as a unity, not as distinct, for our own sake and our own organizing struggles. So I just want to remind us of the fact that people experience their lives not just as class, not just as race, not just as sexuality, but all together as one. And we need to organize as one around that. So,
Clay, I'd like to call on Matt next, since he hasn't spoken, and then I'll circle back to you and then call on myself. Go ahead, Matt.
Hey, can you hear me? Hello, can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So I think this is a really important topic because I personally was really hoping that the Republican issue would just go away, and that clearly is not happening. Back in 2017, I was privileged to witness militant demonstrations when Trump called the MAGA rallies in March of 2017. It seemed very strange to me because he was a sitting president calling rallies for himself. And it seemed evident to me that a person would only do that if they wanted to be something more than president. So the response of a lot of youth was to counter these MAGA rallies using basically physical force. They saw it as justified and necessary to physically disrupt these rallies, or at least to block their march route. And in many cases succeeded, to the point that a little realized fact is that in many ways, Trump supporters were driven off the streets during Trump's own administration, and the only place that Trump supporters could really gather was places where Trump himself was. And all I can say is, I think it's necessary to continue this policy should he come back. And, you know, in my opinion, suppression of anti-fascist rallies is the beginning of the dictatorship of the proletariat. But furthermore, I think we have to talk about other conditions in America, because people are having trouble paying for groceries. People are having trouble paying for housing. These, to me, are the looming issues that never really get talked about, you know, or addressed by the socialist movement. And we have a situation where fascism is looming, climate change is reaching tipping points. And so I think the best anti-fascist defense is a socialist offense. And we need to talk more seriously about how, well, okay. Point being, we may end up needing a sort of color revolution against Trump that you see in different countries, these democracy revolutions of crowds. And I think it's also worth studying the techniques of the people who organize those kinds of things, because we may have to have a socialist revolution in the short-term, midterm future for both reasons of climate, fascism, and just cost of living. So there's a great movie called How to Start a Revolution by about a man named Gene Sharp, very controversial figure, but he basically provides a blueprint of how to overthrow a government. And I think socialists need to be studying these techniques. And finally, the only other thing is, in 2016, Clinton actually did win the popular vote, but lost the Electoral College. And what I'm most afraid of is a repeat of that. Thank you very much to everyone for listening to me.
Okay, I'm going to call in Clay again, and then Susan.
Okay. I don't think it's a question of juxtaposing gender politics to racial politics, but seeing the interconnection between the two. You know, obviously, gender politics or gender questions have been with us ever since matriarchy was overthrown, or maybe even before that, but an extremely long time. And has been primary in that sense. Whereas racial politics has only been around since the creation of the white race. What would that be? Like 300 years ago, 400 years ago, less than 400 years ago. But if you look at the interconnection between racial relations and gender relations, the development of African slavery in the United States powerfully affected the development of gender politics under capitalism. You look at, you know, the role that capitalists took in controlling women's bodies under slavery, absolutely and completely. And the view they had of human reproduction developed under slavery. You know, some has been written about this, much more needs to be written about this, but that powerfully affected how gender politics developed in this country on many different levels. And through this country, because of the leading role that this country has played in the world in terms of culture and many other things within the world. You know, just in one example, it is no accident by any means that the countries that are strongest in the states that are strongest in opposition to abortion, the most backwards on that question happen to be mainly the former slave states. You know, that's one indication of that connection. In terms of the current question, the relationship between the two, I think it's important to look at the lens of all of the basically anti-abortion, LGBTQ, things going on. All of these things, putting the woman back in her place in the family values, all of that is very much related to the Great Replacement theory and the idea of increasing the reproduction rates. Again, the motive behind this, while it's projected often as being religious or moral or something else, the motive behind this is, again, this drive, this resurgence of white supremacy. So I think even with the gender questions that play such an important role in this election now, it is this resurgence of white supremacy that is behind that movement and motivating it in this period. So.
Susan and then John.
Yeah, well, while you were talking about basically plans for organizing and so forth, I was thinking about 2020. And in 2020, there were some discussions that took place, some of which were led by the Highlander Center, and also involved some nonviolence groups, I think mainly out of Philadelphia, and it grew to involve other groups. There was online discussions about, what to do if there's an effort to steal the election. And some of the main thinking about that was to, organize ahead of time so that people expect what to do and have an idea and a plan, before the event occurs, before the election occurs. But the another undercurrent of it was to try to organize in a way that would be large and massive and visible, but strictly nonviolent. And part of the thinking behind that, it wasn't just a matter of principle. It was that there are the far right on the one side, they're the people who are willing to organize and try to oppose the far right on the other side. But then there's a great mass of people who are in the middle, some of whom have roles where they have power, either as election officials or governmental officials or people in the military and the police, who might be able to be influenced to at least do their job. And that was kind of the underlying thinking behind some of those discussions. I looked back in my emails while we were talking here, and a lot of that discussion didn't surface to the level where, a rank and file person like me saw it until after Labor Day. So I'm hoping that kind of thing is going on, but I don't know if anyone here is in touch with the Highlander Center. The Working Families Party also got involved, and they're pretty active in New York State where I live. I don't know how active they are in other states, but they were involved in this, what do we do the day after the election type of planning. So yeah, I think there's a lot that needs to be done, but I guess I'd offer a note of encouragement that it's not just the folks on this call, but there's probably a lot of other discussions like this going on around the country right now. And the question is, how to connect them.
John, go ahead.
I'd like to respond to Clay and some of the other comments also, because my presentation and the discussion was not intended as an analysis of MAGA. It was not intended as what are the political roots or political intention, political goals or anything else of MAGA. It was intended, and to an extent, we had that discussion a couple of weeks ago when we had that debate. This presentation, and I was hoping this discussion would be very specifically on what are MAGA's plans to overturn the election, not what their general politics are. What are MAGA's plans to overturn the election, through what specific means, and what we can do to stop those plans. And so therefore, I think that I can understand Clay's concern, but I think I think he's mistaken in his critique of this presentation. His critique of the left in general, I think he is correct, but that's not what this presentation was about. And I was hoping, for one, that that's not what this discussion would be about. And I think that Susan, who just spoke, I think that her comments were useful, although I see it somewhat differently from her. But that's what we have to discuss here, is it clear what their plans are? Do we take those plans seriously? And if so, what can we do to organize? And also, are the Democrats' plans adequate? And I believe we have to take the Republicans' plan, the MAGA plan, seriously. And I believe, as I tried to point out, that the Democrats' plans are not adequate. As far as the Working Families Party, they are really just basically a kind of a wing of the Democratic Party. And in 2020, I can find the link and post it below, post it in the chat, to a New York Times article in which it explained how NGO leaders and union leaders, and which basically both are Democratic Party representatives, got together to deal with this exact same contingency, and they decided to keep the protests off the streets. And I don't think it's likely that the Democrats will change that approach, which they also had way back in 2000. Now, also, just to backtrack for a minute, what Clay said, he said that that I see the union leadership as the main barrier to white supremacy. But I was saying just the exact opposite. I was saying that I see the unions potentially as the central barrier to white supremacy, potentially. And let's remember that a disproportionate number of black workers, disproportionately high number of black workers, are union members compared to whites. But the union leadership is the barrier to that. So what I'm saying is that we have to go into the union, or encourage union members to get involved to transform their unions. That has to be a central part of any strategy that we have. So just in conclusion, we on the left oftentimes it's absolutely vital that we have a general political viewpoint and understand the general politics. But you can't stop there. We have to discuss the specifics of what specifically is likely to happen or can happen, and concretely how we can organize to stop it. And that's what I think this discussion should focus on.
So Charles Ratchless raised his hand in the chat, and he hasn't spoken yet, so I'm going to call on him wherever you are, Charles.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think if we all watch the convention, it's very clear, especially watching from Leon Panetta, the role of the Democratic Party. It's just the other wing of the imperialist power of the empire, and fascism is what's developing because on the other side of it, because of the crisis and decline of the empire. And we're seeing that it really has nothing to offer the workers of the world except for genocide and inter-imperialist wars. So we need a working class, independent working class opposition. What's necessary to stop the fascist coup in whatever form it comes, whether it comes in another January 6th or whether it comes through attacks on the poll workers and the county or through the Supreme Court, is a united front of the working class to fight for its own party and to fight with its own methods. And those methods, as we should know, are strikes and general strikes, but we need our own party, and we can't have any illusions that support of the Democratic Party is in any way going to prepare the working class for what's needed to stop fascism. I agree that even if they're unsuccessful, that we will be facing MAGA and Trumpism. Even if Trump dies tomorrow, without the demagogue, it will still be an issue. So what's needed more than anything else is a united front of all the forces of the working class to oppose the fascist threat. And that has to be organized in a class struggle method. So I agree with the idea of anti-MAGA committees. They should be based on organizing armed self-defense for the working class and for every single demonstration that we can develop. And our opposition to the MAGA coup is not to put the Democrats in power, but to fight for a workers' government. I agree with the comrade that said we need to put socialism on the agenda. And to do that, yes, we need a party, and we don't have a party. We're not united on many things, but what we should be united on is the necessity to smash fascism in the egg, and to fight in the unions for class independence, and to launch a labor party that uses class struggle methods. That's the point. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to call on myself now, and then I'll go back to the queue. So, unfortunately, all the things that Charles said and that some other people have said about what we'd like to see happen, what we've all, those of us, this generation in our 60s or 70s, have wanted our entire lives, it hasn't happened yet. And we can't make it happen in spite of our desire to make it happen. We have to think about where such sort of small nascent movements might arise and develop that we could have some influence in. And I think that in this moment, people that are people that are fighting against voter suppression, or people that see this danger, that might be one place where such a movement that would entertain the possibility of maybe we do need something independent from the Democrats could begin. But my point is that, we, no one is interested in what Charles was just saying, unfortunately. They're really not really in this moment. Most people are wishful hopers that the Democrats are going to once again save them from capitalism, and they don't even think about it that way. But so, yeah, I'll come back in a little bit later with more thoughts. I'm going to call on, let's see, Talmadge, you haven't spoken for a while. Go ahead. And then I'm going to, okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I think what John was asking here, I think is important, which is, the way I understand it, is what are the pragmatics of what are we doing here? We can talk theory all day long. We can talk about desires all day long. We can talk about how we wish things were this way and not that way. What I hear John saying, what I hear other people say, it is, well, okay, so what do we do? It's what is to be done here? What is the pragmatic, actual process of political action that we as individuals and groups have to engage in this fall to make sure the election is not stolen by the MAGA fascists? And I think what this raises is a very clear question. What do we do about protecting election workers? How do we protect election workers? How do we resist demonstrations by the Proud Boys that might try to gather a block down the street from where polls are opened up? How do we stop them from gathering? How do we disperse them? That's a practical thing. How do we do in legal actions to go against things that are clearly illegal? I put in the chat earlier on about Crew, which, as bourgeois as it might be, is one of the only groups I know that's actually developing a legal strategy for going after those election officials who decide that they don't want to certify the election because it doesn't go for Trump. I think we need to be exploring all these options. I'm not saying it's the only option, of course not. But we need to be exploring what are the range of options of practical, actual activity that we can engage in, whether it's going door to door, whether it's talking to our unions, whether it's talking to our friends and neighbors. This is the reality of politics, not theorizing. And so I just wanted to kind of get us back on track of thinking about what is the reality that we're confronting here, and not just have a debate, which I'm used to academically, about how these things should go. So that's just my thing.
I'm going to call on Jan Hageland.
I'm the only one who I think doesn't have English as my real language, so I will try to make myself understood anyway. And it's a bit overwhelming, this perspective of what can be done, what can happen in the United States. I mean, I was born in 1953 and participated in the anti-war demonstrations against what the US was doing in Vietnam and so on. But raised politically in the heritage that there were two bourgeois parties in the United States, the Republicans and the Democrats. But John's lead-off opened up a sort of new perspective in the short run. And I don't think I've heard, I try to follow this. There is a magazine called Foreign Affairs, and I sometimes read articles from it, and I think that's pretty much the US elite who is discussing with themselves about different strategies. China is on the rise economically, and what are we going to do? And as far as I can tell, there are real concern, even amongst people who write articles in a magazine like Foreign Affairs about what is going to happen. They were, I think, two main articles about this decision by the Supreme Court of changing the balance between the presidency, the legislation, I mean the Congress with the Senate and the the House of Representatives and the Supreme Court. They were very worried, or at least they were worried. Things was going on. There is something that is going to change. It's about to change. So I think John has a point in raising these questions. I mean, I don't think there is anybody here who is believing in the salvation from problems by the Democratic Party. But I'm from Sweden, Europe, and to me, and there is a lot of people who call themselves, or they are socialist. They would not agree with me, but to me, there is a sort of, this is, what's the name when you, there is just one question on the agenda. The people vote for one question. It's not an election. It's I'm looking for the word. Should we have
a referendum?
A referendum, yes, thank you. I mean, there is a sort of referendum. Should we keep abortion rights for women or not? And should we defend what's left of the Obamacare, or, well, I don't know the right way to put it, but Medicare? I mean, the election is a sort of referendum about, for me, when I look at the election in the United States, it's a sort of referendum. To keep abortion rights, yes or no? To keep Medicare, yes or no? And also to keep what we call the bourgeois democracy, yes or no? And we need definitely a workers' party in the United States. And I talked to a guy that 1990, Tony Mazzocchi. I met him in Denver. We talked for 5 hours. I recorded it. It was a fascinating discussion. and he was very radical on every issue, environmental and everything. But he didn't want, he was afraid to go all the way. Now we don't have time. It's the election is the November 5. And I don't know, this group and me, what can we do in the short time that's left? Well, if we believe that there is no respect for bourgeois democracy amongst the MAGA Republicans, we have to get people. I never thought I would say this, but we can. I don't know if we can do anything else but to say you have to vote to stop the MAGA. You have to defend abortion right. You have to defend Medicare, and you have to defend bourgeois democracy. And to me, the only way to defend that is to vote to take the democratic ballot paper and put it in the box, but not to recruit people to the Democratic Party. But what we can do to November the 5th is to warn people. If you want to keep abortion rights, if you want to keep Medicare, and if you want to keep the bourgeois democracy, well, this is what you can do in the short run. But during that way, we start, of course, to try to build a workers' party or a labor party, or what do we call it? I don't know. But I don't know what you think. I'm from Sweden. But there is a threat. I believe that's right. I couldn't imagine when I listened to, I will stop soon. Well, I listened to Donald Trump talking to this courageous guy. He was a Republican in Georgia. He told him to find the exact number of votes. To find it was to create them, to cheat. He wasn't afraid to ask this guy, I'm the president, I want you to find 11,000 so-and-so many votes. That's a way of cheating. And to me, as a European, it's still in Europe. If somebody would get caught with doing that, his career would be over. I can tell you, it's still that way, at least in Sweden. And then the storming of the capital with a threat to kill, and even this threat to kill his own vice president with this, the gallows, symbolizing what Trump does even to the people who is most, most solidarity. Yeah, you know what I mean. His vice president was very much in favor of him. Still, there was a gallows hanging, symbolizing what how he could have ended up. So the threat, I think, I don't know how real the threat are. I think the threat are real. I don't know how strong it is, but it's real. And with the help of this Kennedy guy, I don't know how this will change.
I'm sorry. I have to stop you, as I know. Please feel free to come back in.
Yes. Thank you. That's what I wanted to say. The threat is real.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to actually call on Megan next, because she hasn't spoken at all. And then I see that Linda and Clay are in the line. And so go ahead, Megan.
Okay, thanks. So appreciate all the comments so far, and just want to try to dig into a little bit of the tactical stuff, like springboarding off of what Talmadge was saying, right? And also a little bit what Jan was saying about just like what's the near term and what's the middle term and what's the long term, right? Because we have to also think in those terms, because anyhow, and I appreciate that John is raising the issue of what are we actually going to do for November. So I think, John Ryman, you've raised something that's really hard because we're not organized. We're not organized, and that's just a fact, right? Like, we're not, I think, overwhelmingly sufficiently organized, because you look at the pro-Palestine marches and how barely organized those are, and we just don't have infrastructure in place, and that sucks, because that kind of answers our question, right? So, like, I think the small, like, unsatisfying answers are little tiny Antifa groups around the country are going to play a role. Liberals with spinal columns are going to show up and play a role. And I think the left, that is the Putinized left, is going to play less of a role because they don't take any of this very seriously. And they are the ones who are very committed to having people punt on the one action that everybody should be taking to produce a landslide for Kamala Harris, on only as a way to stop Trump, right? Which would be to vote for the Democrats. And as Jan said, vote for them, but not in any sense recruiting people for the party. Absolutely not. This is all strategy. So, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be doing calls to get out the vote. I don't know if the group could ever like promote that, but that's what I will be doing. And the other thing that we don't discuss often enough, and I agree with Clay generally, that it's like the white supremacy aspect of fascism and its intersectional, like bear hug, right? Between like wanting to harm everybody from Black, Indigenous folks, people of color, trans folks, throw everybody possible under the bus in service of what Bell Hooks very aptly named, and I'm probably going to mess it up. I apologize. You guys can put it in the chat. But, white supremacist, patriarchal, imperialist capitalism, right? That was like her quadfecta of things. Like, I think that's accurate. It can never just be one. It has to be all 4 or 5 items coming in simultaneously. Ableism too. So the other thing that does not get talked about, you guys, is the pandemic, is the fact that we're on year 4.5 of an unmitigated worker crisis, of the workers of the United States and the world being absolutely decimated by COVID. And we're on the brink of bird flu popping off. And I just had someone send me photos in New York City who's covered in monkeypox, or Mpox as they rebranded it. So, like, if the kids in Williamsburg, New York City, and Brooklyn are covered in monkeypox, I think it's airborne. If you're not masking, please start masking immediately and start reading about it, because you're behind the curve. And for everybody else, like, the far right understands very well that the plague benefits them, and they've been leveraging it, right? And so the thing that everybody who has raised the issue of, like, we need a labor party, yes, we do. And we need the unions to get it together, yes, we do. The thing that the unions are also punting on is protecting their workers from stuff that is going to kill them. Like, every time you get an infection with COVID, you have a 1 in 5 chance of getting long COVID, which I've had for 5 years. If anybody doesn't know about it, feel free to reach out to me. I'll send you links. But those are odds that people in Vegas are like, those are bad odds. There's a reason why the guy who's like the champion of poker of the whole world shows up in an N95 mask to play his games. So I think we're going to see monkeypox taking off. I might be wrong, but I think there's a strong chance that concurrent with this election and all the other stuff is we're going to be seeing a public health crisis on top of public health crisis, and which will create problems, because part of why we're going to be increasingly like getting the short end of the stick on producing resistance is long COVID produces a disability that makes people fatigued. That's part of why, again, the Democrats are not going to protect people, because it benefits them to suppress the left. That's why they're fine with mass infecting the left and having so many people, in particular folks, Black, Indigenous, people of color, and LGBTQ folks have the worst outcomes, are the most likely to get disabled and or die. And so I think that if we're going to actually really seriously start answering this question, it has to also be with a lens that is anti-ableist, and it is getting people involved in unions totally clued in with, I don't know if you guys know this, but every city in the country has a mask block where they give out free N95s, and it's based on like, you know, kind of like Black Bloc and anarchist principles of independent organizing. And so there are places that in theory we could partner with the mask blocks if they are radical enough to build resistance through the mask blocks, but it would require that we have sufficiently upped our literacy and our understanding and our politics around COVID and monkeypox, and how the destruction of public health and the capturing of our institutions, the CDC, NIH, HHS, etc. Those of all the part of why we're here is because they have been captured by the right already. It's not a future facing thing, it's a past tense. Like the people in charge of researching long COVID is Palantir. Who runs Palantir? Peter Thiel. Who is Peter Thiel? The puppeteer for JD Vance, right? So, and as this relates to Clay, and I'll try to wrap it up here, Clay's argument around white supremacy, 1,000%. Like what we're seeing is a Silicon Valley Third Reich, people who are literally pro Soylent Green policies are trying to take power, and they're riding in on the pathway that Donald Trump has paved. He's just the tool, but they're the ones who are serious, and they're the ones who are organized, and they are best friends with, I forget the name of it, the guys who produce Project 2025. The organization starts with an H, Heritage Foundation. And then the other element to all of this, and part of why the left is so kneecapped, and we all understand this, is like, you know, Putin's in the middle of all of this. And we can't forget that. And so the angle that I've been taking, I'm sorry that this isn't like the best answer, right? But it's, the angle I've been taking is that like telling people, I'm like, Palestine will not get free. Like, I know you want Palestine to be free, right? But let's say you get your arms embargo. If the US fully backs out and never gives another penny to Israel, who do you think is going to replace them? Nobody is thinking about that there are absolutely monstrous fascist authoritarian powers waiting in the wings to fill that gap. And so that I do think is also part of our discussion as we work towards trying to like stop the steal, which we have to, I don't know how we fully actually do that, but I think one of the most concrete things we can do is actually get out the vote, because if we do have a landslide, it makes it harder. But 1,000%, yeah, the Dems are not going to be able to adequately figure out how to do it. And so we have to keep talking. Anyways, thanks you guys. I hope some of that was useful.
I'm going to come back in and try to make my points more clearly. And then I'll circle back to Clay, Linda, and then I think we'll finish up with John, unless somebody else raises their hand. First off, I think it would be really useful and important to have a whole separate forum on the question that Clay has raised about why this election is a referendum on white supremacy, and that the left itself has a totally blind eye towards the question of white supremacy. I think it needs and deserves a lot more discussion and filling out. Clay wrote a piece explaining this position in more detail that was on our listserv, and John put it on his blog site. I think you should put that in the chat, John. That would be really useful, because it's really, you can say a lot more about that. Like, I think a lot of people, like when you say white supremacy, what do people even think about? But so I want to suggest that we do that. The second thing is, I want to just follow up on what Megan said about, you know, it is the intention, whether it's this year or down the road, for the authoritarians of the world, led by Putin, to destroy voting rights as we know them. And I know we've already addressed that a couple of weeks ago, but I think that's not a small thing. And the chaos they are hoping for and doing whatever they can behind the scenes to make sure that there is absolute chaos during the electoral process. What I'm trying to do as an individual is, everybody that I talk to that I know cares or gives a damn about this election, I talk to them about this possibility, and I explain to them about these mechanisms that are already in place and how they're much more organized than they were 4 years ago. And most people don't want to hear it, but here's what people are saying to me. People are telling me that they're getting a gun. That's what they're telling me. And I'm like, these are people who I never these are all women, by the way, who are saying, I'm going to get a gun. And because I'm really worried about what's going to happen during the elections, before, during, and after. And then 2 other people said to me, if they try to overturn the election results, that would get me into the streets. But in neither of those situations or responses is there any structure or organization so far. And I mean, that's my own personal survey, and I'm continuing to do that. I think that's a really good way to engage people, is ask them, are you aware that of these things and what they say about it? And then there's other people who say, oh no, the Democrats have got it wrapped up. So the other, just to address again the long-term strategy, as Megan mentioned, and others, is that the left has no vision. The socialist left presents nothing to the working class, absolutely zero. They, as I said in my presentation a couple of weeks ago, the ideas of socialism, if they're explained well, are very appealing to most people, but they're not being explained, and there's no structure. And that, if nothing else, that's going to allow a fascist movement to just continue to grow in this country, because people don't have anything else. They've got nothing else but the Democrats at this point. So that's the hole that needs to be filled. And we have, again, not to make the same points as I did do, the entire left is dominated by campism. That's why we are here, this small group that actually stands, does everything we can to be consistently anti-imperialist, consistently opposed to oppression around the world. So I just want to make that point, that we need our own version of Project 2025, or call it something completely different. And I really want everybody here to be thinking about that. Like, how would we write such a document, and what would all the pieces of it look like? We need to start that. And we need to start it now, because we're never, ever going to have an independent movement or party of the working class or Labor Party without that first, because nobody's going to be interested in a bunch of rhetoric. So, okay. All right. So, okay, I'm going to call on Tom. You go by Thomas or Tom? Tom. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to call on Tom because he hasn't spoken at all, and then go back to Clay, Linda, and then give John the last word.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thomas is always fine. It's always okay. It seems to me, from having listened through the entire discussion. So first of all, I wanted to just thank again John for this presentation. I am for people who don't know me, I'm calling in from the Netherlands. I'm the other European, I guess, in the group, and a lot of the details that John has mentioned have been things that I have not heard yet in the media that I've been able to follow on YouTube and in other social media, American media, about the election. So this is really important for me. So that was an important detail that I didn't understand yet. The other thing that it seems to me is that since everybody, starting from Clay to Linda to Megan, brought in is almost seems to me like a very good, including with what Susan brought in, a very good survey of all those structures that already are in place. So we already have groups like people coming up for social justice, for racial justice and racial equality. So it seems that there are hopefully already people organizing to help, especially Black voters, brown voters, and support them when they are going to vote. So how can I do? What can I do to help you vote? Because you know that there's somebody in a gerrymandered system, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's something that locals will probably be much better to be able to figure out than I'm from here, from this end. But these small things are some things that everybody can do. And then indeed, if you come up and you're the one person who's masking up, and if you're the one person who is pragmatic, and if you're the one person whose things actually make sense, people will flock to you. Especially younger people will come to you for sure, and they will ask. And then you can tell them, oh, and by the way, I'm from this group, the Ukraine Socialist, and we have our meetings. And then I'm sure that whichever group you go to, whichever organization appeals to you and that you feel personally you can go to, I bet your bottom dollar that you'll find people who will be interested in helping you to write, and that we'll get a much larger constituency, a much more diverse constituency to actually start writing such an alternative to Project 2025. Something that is very pragmatic. And indeed, yes, we can talk forever. And like in the last meeting, like, oh, but if world revolution happens and all these romantic ideas, which are all very fine, but I would even go for the guns if nothing else happens. So maybe this could be seen as an encouragement for everybody. So it's not, rather than giving in and saying, oh, we don't have, it seems like all of you have already a lot of good perspectives that could interact very well. So if you keep each other organized and informed about what you're doing, oh, I'm going to talk about this person, I'm going to, I don't know, there are various groups. I know that there are two people, Docket Democracy, I think, and then somebody called Legia Miller, who seems a pretty sharp analyst, to start raising your voice and start talking and start making comments, maybe even start making comments on social media and say, hey, I put a YouTube comment out, and then one or two people will actually maybe see it. I mean, these are things that everybody can do, or somebody can do, depending on how you feel. Thank you for your time.
Clay.
I think the situation we face in this election is that ever since Trump came down that escalator in 2015, talking about immigrants coming into the country that were rapists and murderers, and raising that fear, a section of the capitalist class, a section of the bourgeoisie, has seen him, in a growing section, by the way, has seen him as a way to, he's kind of taking leadership of a movement that's become this magnum movement that has utilized racism, largely racism, to promote this movement toward authoritarian rule. And you see his propaganda all along the line has been about that. And much more so now, especially on the immigrant thing, where he talks about all the time about they're emptying their prisons here, they're sending rapists, they're sending murderers, you know, this immigrant crime wave, the Biden immigrant crime wave, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is where he is speaking to and motivating the electorate. So if we want to counter that, we have to recognize that, you know, it's really a core thing that they're going after, and we have to counter that with our own anti-racist propaganda and organizing. And it has to be explicitly so. You know, John, the reason I kind of criticize or respond the way I did to your presentation is I did hear you saying that it was the corrupt union leadership that was the main barrier to a working class party and working class power. And I think the corrupt union leadership is part of it. Obviously, they're instruments of it. But the main barrier is largely an ideological one, a cultural one. And that is white supremacy. It has been historically for the working class in this country. And the problem now is this magnum movement, a section of the bourgeoisie, again under Trump's leadership, but not necessarily always under Trump's leadership, because he could be replaced, is attempting to ride that into overthrowing bourgeois democracy. And the reason why I see people, or a certain section of even the working class is drawn to that is because they see we are facing a situation in this country where white people will no longer be in the majority. And Trump and this Magnum Moon has been able to raise a lot of fears among these people. What will happen when these people are no longer in the majority? When you're no longer in the majority, terrible things will happen. And that's really the basis core of their movement. That's why the great replacement theory, is so attractive to them, and they can promote that. In a way, even not looking at the politics and the different party positions, et cetera, now, where it's no longer one old white man faces another old white man with different politics, now we have a Black Asian woman facing a white supremacist. So that really puts the question, and the question that is going to be put to the electorate that will decide this election, which will be to white people in certain swing states, can you be comfortable with a Black Asian woman commander-in-chief? And that's one of the core, that is putting in very concrete terms, one of the core, say, cultural questions that has to be decided on this. And so now to briefly address the question of, how do we stop the Republican plans to nullify your vote? I think that's going to have to be mass action. And where we are now, our level of organization, it's going to have to be bringing whatever experience and whatever kind of organizational skills and capabilities we have to more or less spontaneous mass actions that I hope will arise like that they did when here locally the Santa Monica Committee for Racial Justice was attacked by white supremacists from Orange County and Santa Monica, where we were able to rally over 1,000 people to confront them and just outnumber them, or how people rallied across the country after the murder of George Floyd, or even how people on the campuses that rallied around the Free Palestine movement. When the Republicans try to seize power illegally, when election boards refuse to certify, hopefully we can help organize mass activities around those and a mass response to those, nonviolent, peaceful demonstrations, or frankly, whatever is necessary. But again, we have to recognize that the motivating thing is this long, 300-year-old, 400-year-old demon that has always divided the U.S. working class, and that is white supremacy. And what we need to be taking on to combat all the attempts and plans to nullify the vote or most of all of them are based on this. So we need to be able to counter that with our own anti-racial campaign or anti-racist campaign.
Brian?
Oh, okay. Yeah, I didn't hear that. Sorry. Yeah, I think that on the one hand, listening to folks and that sort of thing, seeing that there isn't a large socialist organization out in the streets doing things on a daily basis. One of the things I think is that people have to just start working with other people who are doing similar sort of work, even though, they may be, believers in the system and stuff, whether it's people who are out there registering people to vote right now and that sort of thing. Because it's really important. I mean, one of the things that's going on, people are worried about this MAGA stuff, I understand, but there's been a whole voter suppression drive across the nation, which has been pretty successful. And it could end up making a big difference in the elections this fall. All sorts of different states are jettisoning people from the voting rolls. So just defending democracy is a good socialist thing to do. And it means working with, I think, other people who are involved in that. I'm going to put in a couple of articles, recent articles, about things that have been happening over the past week in Virginia, Florida, Ohio, and elsewhere, where thousands of people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are being evicted from the voting rolls. And I think that's a part of it. The other thing, too, that is going on, that's quietly, but there's been a real push on Board of Elections, populating them with people who are anti-democratic. And I think that that'll be the first one. It won't necessarily be, some big move to the streets, but there is a good chance of the elections being challenged, whether or not there's an overwhelming vote. Hillary Clinton, I think, won by 3 million. Biden won by 5 million. Elections were still challenged. I don't think that the amount will, and especially with the Electoral College, it's actually a toss-up right now. It's really close. And, Harris could end up getting the vast majority of votes, again, not the vast majority, but a sizable majority of votes this time and still lose. There's a real good chance that she can do that. And so people have to be ready, one, to defend things. If you lose, it throws up a whole different sense of organizing. But if she wins, and it's sizable, but then there's challenges to the election and stuff like that, that's where people, I think, need to be working with others. And now's the time to do that, helping out wherever it is in your community on either meeting people, helping with voter registration drives and that sort of thing. Because that's how you meet people and that's how you win them to your end. I think socialists have a tendency to win when people show that they deliver, and you deliver where they're at. You don't bring them over to our end and, all of a sudden convert them to a different way of thinking. I think, when you're pushing through and helping them achieve what you both want, it's a much better way of reaching folks. So I think that those are just things to keep in mind as we move forward about things to do. Yeah, there are things to do right now because we ourselves alone can't do too much. And there are people out there doing things in our communities, as mentioned by Susan and others, that the idea of coalitions and whatever that I think Amina put in, that's really important at this point in time because we don't have the strength to march on our own and then attract people to us. We have to move into other organizations and stuff. And then looking at a continuum, one of the things is everything's on the table. So you end up having to, you don't bring a knife to a gunfight. People have to be willing to admit that, there's a good chance of violence and stuff like that. And just keep in mind, how do you respond to that and that sort of thing? Because it may not necessarily be peaceful anyways. I mean, people who've been involved in the past, like myself, with like defending reproductive rights clinics and stuff like that, it was physical. The defense was physical. You were pushing people out of the way. You were shoving people down the street. You were pushing them into the street. I mean, these things do happen. I'm not saying that it has to happen, but I think that people have to keep in mind that everything is on the table. And your actions will be determined by the immediate situation that you're presented with. That's enough.
Okay, Amina has raised her hand and she hasn't spoken yet, so go ahead, Amina.
Yeah, hi. Hi, I'm a real person. I'm just tired. Okay, off. uh, Something that occurred to me, I don't know if anybody mentioned it while I had to step out of the room or whatever, but this election is different in that Israel and Zionism have become very large issues in this country. And I don't know, I live in New York City. There are a lot of Zionists. They're very hostile. They're very, they're not reasonable. And a lot of them are supporting Trump. And also the Israel lobby. I'm not really aware of, I think AIPAC just buys off everybody. They don't care if they're Republican or Democrat, but what role does the Israel lobby play, and how significant would the Zionist vote be, not only at the actual on election day, but would they be involved in trying to overturn a Harris victory? Because, I've attended some protests and some of the college occupation, and I've encountered these people, and they're very extreme, and they can be violent. In fact, I have had acquaintances that were hurt by them physically. So I mean, I'm not expecting anybody to have concrete. We can't predict the future, you know, but does anybody, excuse me, have any insight? Because we're not talking about, we're not talking about it, how it's going to affect the election, and I think it can be a big part of the threat of a Trump victory. So if anybody has any thoughts, you know, I would appreciate it.
Okay, well, Thomas just raised his hand. Okay, Linda, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the last two people just sort of segued into what I'm going to talk about. And that's the violence that these people are responsible for and the threats they pose. We've already discussed, you know, it referred to Gretchen Whitmer being almost kidnapped, people being shot, like Gabby Giffords. I mean, these are very violent people, and that's in the core. You know, that's something that we should look for, because in the past, like during the Weimar Republic, the fascist SA killed like 400 people, you know, officials in the Weimar government. You know, Mussolini was responsible for killing socialist officials. I mean, this is something that they do, and they usually get away with it. I just Googled, you know, Trump threatens Republican officials, and you see the New York Times Trump just from this past year, you know, the 2024 Trump threatens Republicans who won't help him exact revenge on Democrats, or, you know, like these bogus investigations. Washington Post: Republicans fear they'll be targets of Trump after Trump threatens to blacklist Nikki Haley donors. How Trump is tightening his grip on the Republican Party. Death threats influence Republicans to follow Trump, and the threat of violence is changing American politics. That's Vox. And this is just like one page. I could go on to the next. And this I mean the Democrats are kind of like the old liberals in the Weimar Republic, and those. I mean they're very ineffective at confronting this, and it's and usually the burden is just on ordinary people to stand up to this violence all the time. What we have seen works is there are two reasons why we've had less violence by fascists lately. It may not seem. I mean, we've actually have had some violence, but there's less. You know, this stuff in the street all the time. You know, the anti-fascist groups help drive the fascists away from a lot of cities like Portland, Oregon, and here in Minneapolis, and plus other big cities. But the other thing that happened is there were actual prosecutions for the January 6th rioters, and that did a lot to shut these people up. But you know, the threat is always there. And I was just reading I was trying to find this article that I was reading, and I can't find it. It's how government officials and Republican members of the Senate and House are just under constant harassment and threats, not just to them, but to their families. You know, if they do anything at all to piss Trump off, like the Republicans that voted to impeach, you know, that was one. But then there's also election officials, not just it was Raffensperger in Georgia, but there are other lower level officials. Many of whom have been forced out of their jobs or have just given up, and they've been replaced by these assholes that are ready to not certify the election. But you know, the threat of violence is something that's really easy to overlook because nobody really wants to confront it. But you know, that's really one of the main ways in which these people, you know, get their way and overturn democracies.
So, Talmud, I know that you'll make it brief, and then we'll give John the last word.
Yeah, I will try to make it brief. Just to respond to Amina's point about the Arab American vote, for example, in Gaza, and what the polling data that I've seen reveal is that actually Gaza is a very minor, if not at all, important position for swing state voters. That's what the data shows. Clearly, that doesn't apply to Arab Americans or Palestinians like living in Michigan. It's a central concern for them. I understand that. But if we're going to be real about this and look at the real data, what the data demonstrates is that most folks are more concerned about the economy, followed by abortion rights and other types of things. So I think when we debate these issues, we really have to be clear about who we're talking about and why we're talking about them. And so this doesn't mean, I think it's sad. It's a sad statement of Americans that they don't see that. But I think it's demonstrated by the fact that the turnout at the DNC, the protests, the pro-Palestinian protests, were so muted. And part of the reason that was happening was in part because the uncommitted movement could get no more than 30 representatives out of 5,000 at the DNC to even show up. So I have had this argument with some of my graduate students who kind of take the moral position, which I agree with, that it's reprehensible, the genocide that's going on. But there's also the political realities of what we're dealing with here. And the fact of the matter is that most Americans are not as concerned about what's going on in Gaza as we think they should be. And we need to kind of face that reality squarely and understand that. And as I said to my friend, if you decide to withhold your vote, which is what she said on Facebook, you're voting for Trump. That's the reality of it, because there's only two parties involved here other than Stein, which is just another debate. So I just wanted to raise that because I think that we're kind of talking as if we know what the data is. And I thought that it's important to actually look at the real data of what's going on with the polling procedures in these various states and what's happening. I think that's all I have to say. There was something I wanted to respond to at Linda's point, but I forgot what it was. So I'll stop.
Okay, John, you get the last word as the presenter.
So, first of all, in response to Amina, the Zionists in the United States are not all one solid block. And a good chunk of them are supporting the Democrats, which I think is part, although not all of the reason, why Harris and company have been so hesitant to really express opposition to what Israel's doing. The other part is that the United States, U.S. capitalism needs Israel. I'm not saying that's a positive thing, on the contrary, and that's a whole other issue. As far as what Brian said there's a good chance the elections will be challenged. I guess that wasn't really clear in my presentation, because I think it's a certainty that it will be challenged. And what I was trying to do was present the different ways in which it's likely to be challenged. Now, in reply to Clay, there's no contradiction, I don't think, between what I was saying about the role of the union leadership and what Clay was saying. Because, like everybody else, workers have to have a group identity. And if what the role of the union leadership has been to suppress as much as humanly possible the group identity as being part of the working class. And so if you're not going to identify as being a worker first and foremost, in America, how are you going to identify? For white people, there's going to be a very, very powerful tendency to identify as being white. That's where white supremacy comes in. So I don't think there's any conflict between what I was saying and that directly relates to the issue of why no working class party. Because if the overwhelming majority of workers do not identify as being part of the working class, not just on the job, but in society as a whole, then what flows from that is that there's not going to be a drive from below for a working class party. That is to have their own political independence. And incidentally, I've seen directly, personally, where white workers who support Trump, when they got engaged in the class struggle, not just against the employer, but also against their own union leadership, that all of that tended to fall to the wayside. And identifying as a worker and supporting and also including in that opposition to white supremacy tended to come to the forefront. It didn't just once and for all in a lasting way happen, but you could see that tendency. So I don't think that there's any contradiction there. Just to get back to the main points, I think that we have to start by asking ourselves, what is the general situation? And in particular, what is the general mood that exists in the United States? And I said it, I think Cheryl said it in a somewhat different way. The general mood is, as far as those who want to fight MAGA and everything that it represents, let's rely on the Democrats and hope for the best. And we don't need to organize independently on our own, independent of the Democrats. That is the general mood, I think. Now, if the Republicans make a serious effort and a partially or fully successful effort to steal the elections, then I think that that could start to shatter that mood. And if you just look at what happened with the George Floyd protests, all of a sudden, it wasn't a matter of what socialists did. What they did or didn't do, every single socialist could have gone into a 10-year coma. It wouldn't have mattered. That protest movement would have developed out in the streets. And so I think that there may be a tendency to develop like that. And the question is, then how do we connect with that? And Charles raised this issue, well, we don't fight for a government of the Democrats. Well, yes and no. Because just take, for instance, in the civil rights movement, when the central campaign was around the right to vote. No, I think that what should have been connected with that was the need for a working class party, but nevertheless, with or without that, any socialist worth a damn would have campaigned for the right to vote for Black people in the South. And if that means that they were going to vote for the Democrat or reconstituted Democrats, that means it's going to be co-opted into the Democratic Party, well, that's another issue. But still, we have to support that. And in this case, I think that we absolutely have to support have to be engaged in opposition to the Republicans stealing the elections. That's a fundamental right in bourgeois democracy, a fundamental democratic right for elections in some form or another. And we absolutely have to support it. But the whole point is, how would a movement like that tend to develop? And again, not what we want. What we want, you could multiply the people in this Zoom meeting by 1,000 times over. It wouldn't make a damn bit of difference as far as what actually develops, because we don't have the power to influence events. How will a movement like that tend to develop? And just by the fact of getting out into the streets, getting in, and we would advocate going into the workplaces, which I think would tend to happen. Just by that, it would tend to take on a head of steam, a life of its own. That's exactly why the Democrats every single time have tried to divert away from something like that. It wasn't just like Democratic Party like Kamala Harris or Chuck Schumer or Barbara Lee or something like that. It was their representatives, the non-profiteers and the union leadership. And so I think that we should encourage that. And incidentally, as far as people going out and getting a gun, they can get a gun or not as they like. Nothing wrong with that. But if those people on the left think that they are going to stand up to MAGA with the few little pitiful guns that they have, compared to the assault rifles and I think this machine guns and every other goddamn thing that AP3 and these groups have, and years of training. And if they think that that's going to stop them, and again, I'm in favor of self-defense, but the question of organizing is what has to come first. So I think then, you know, I've advocated for years and years and years the necessity to break from the Democrats and build a working class party. The question is, how is it likely to develop here in the United States? And it's not going to develop by a few thousand socialists getting out and giving speeches about it and forming this, that, or the other coalition for a Labor Party or a Workers' Party. It's going to develop out of the movement itself. And that movement, if a sector of the working class is involved in it, it will tend to head in that direction. And then it's up to us to explain the significance of that and explain what is the next necessary and possible steps along those lines. And I think that what would be central in that is to insist that the movement be organized democratically with a small d. That which did not happen, by the way, during the George Floyd protests. That we have our own meetings in order to organize the movement and organize the next protest, and also to discuss what would be the strategy and what would be the main politics of this protest movement. And through that, I think that there will be a tendency then for leaders of that movement to run for office, more so at the local or regional level than at the national level. And then the question will be, will they run for office through the Democratic Party or through this embryonic organization, this movement that's developing independently of the Democrats? And I think absolutely we have to say independent of and opposed to the Democrats. So, and also the question of socialism will tend to arise, and we have to help it rise. So that's the question, is how to connect our more medium and long-term ideas with what we think might develop or will develop in some way or another, just almost spontaneously on its own. And what do we think will tend to develop spontaneously on its own? And as I said, how do we connect with it? And all the bombast, you know, just in the abstract means nothing if there's not a movement to, you know, that can make it real in some real concrete way.
Oh, I guess Talmadge gets the last word. But before he does, I just want to say we are planning on having one more forum related to the elections in October, possibly in September, but at some point in the next couple months. And it will be, we're hoping it will be kind of an international perspective, you know, views from activists in other countries like Ukraine and Iran on the impact of the elections and what people think about it there. So I just wanted to make that announcement. And Talmadge, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to make a few points about organizing. A couple things. One is the funding process. How and where does the money come from to even establish a foundation for an organization that can spread the word? The second is the actual pragmatics of how you do it. I was a member of the Campaign for Economic Democracy. I worked with Tom Hayden in Santa Monica for about a year or so, doing canvassing and training canvassers. And I know in discussions with him, you know, it raises the question, for example, the strategy of the Students for a Democratic Society, the SDS, that was popular in the 60s, that fell apart with the Weather Underground. But I think we have to remember that even that is an example of organizing. The SDS was incredibly successful across the country in organizing against the Vietnam War, but people forget that its origins didn't start with the war, but started with community-based organizing. That is, working in local communities on local issues. And it's those issues which actually generated the movement necessary to create the foundation for the anti-war movement. It took 10 years to do it. So none of the stuff we're talking about is going to happen in 30 days or overnight. We're talking about a long-term process, a structural process of how to get funding, how to find recruits, how to develop a democratic organization, how and what our position should be in relationship to other political parties. All of that are fundamental questions, but I just want to make one last point, which is if people want to see a response to the 2025 debacle document produced by the Heritage Foundation, I encourage all of you to go back and look at the early Port Huron statement that was done back in the 1960s as a way to think about an alternative position outside the Democratic Party and outside the Republican Party, but one that was opposed at that time to the war. It's probably the best document we have at that point. It's a bit dated. I used to teach it in my classes. I had my students as an assignment come up with an updated version of the Port Huron statement, which they put out in the local university. So look at the Port Huron statement if you want something that might be a model for how we might move ahead. It's a bit old, but I think it's useful, and I'll just leave it there.